Right. I thought it'd be a bit of fun from a principal's point of view or understanding the concepts behind things to go through what a tank is. It's something that seems to get wrong pretty frequently in media, and something actually I think is a really interesting way of looking at principles-based design, really trying to understand what you're trying to achieve. First off is you'll hear a lot of people talking about iron triangles and things like that, which is really about lethality versus survivability versus mobility. And really, that's a way of assessing the combat capability of a frontline vehicle. A lot of the time it's worth actually considering what the other roles attributed to that vehicle are. And it's worth understanding that at one extreme end of the spectrum, you've got something like a tank. Its sole job is to fight. And at the other end of that spectrum, you've got something like a civilian road truck. So what I've done is I've put together a little graph, or something like a sort of a line to really understand what we're talking about here. And it's worth understanding that a role can look like combat but not be necessarily exactly the same thing. Something like a recovery vehicle doesn't have a lot of payload, but obviously it's carrying a whole shitload of recovery equipment, which stops it from being a functional combat vehicle. It's functionally a transport or logistics role. Same thing's true of ammunition carriers. When you look at it, ultimately things like air defense and artillery are really the same thing. They're functionally a gun truck. So if you look at it from that point of view, really what you're talking about is this continuum towards frontline combat versus logistics and what it's doing. It's actually quite important to understand that there's a big wedge sitting behind every frontline combat vehicle of logistics to actually get it to that point. When you talk about infantry supporting tanks is a really good example. You need to get the infantry to where the tanks are, which means that you need APCs or IFVs, even though they're more transport focused than a tank is. Yeah, to have a look at the truck part for a bit, just to really flesh this out and get a feel for what we're talking about, at least in a little bit of detail. When you look at a civilian truck versus a military truck, it becomes a bit easier to understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these compromises. When you give a truck bigger tyres, you actually reduce its capacity to carry payload and you make it a bit harder to operate on-road. So you reduce its weight to payload ratio, you make it more expensive to operate, all that sort of stuff. When you add armour, that takes away from payload. When you add a whole bunch of other stuff to those trucks to make them more capable in a military environment, you make them less capable as a truck. The second thing to really understand is protection. So when you talk about protection, if you look at it purely from a volume point of view or a thickness, nothing really protects as well as a giant slab of steel. But that becomes almost immediately impossible based on mass when you're talking about threats that are past a pretty low level, really, small arms, that sort of stuff. And so people start implementing more complex armour technologies, and they very rarely, if ever, bring the volume of the armour down. They generally make them a lot lighter though. So you trade off basically cost, complexity and maintenance against basically that mass. So the volume doesn't tend to go down. Sometimes or frequently it goes up, or you can trade off volume to get better protection for less mass. But ultimately, it's a good way of looking at the protection levels of vehicles, looking at how much of the vehicle is basically dedicated to protection systems when we're talking about that aspect of it. Now, the third thing which is useful to talk about before we talk about this in any more detail is really to give a sense of scale to this stuff, what we're talking about when we're talking about the lethality and the weapon systems on a vehicle. And I like to bring it back to like road transport analogies. Everybody gets pictures of what crashes look like and stuff like that because you can look them on YouTube, and it's something you can sort of mentally picture for yourself. So if you look at it from the point of view of what military tend to look at as small, medium and large caliber weapons, small calibers generally taken to be below 20 millimeter. That's really defined based on whether or not you can put basically a fill in a shell. When you can put a fill in, you can start putting explosives, fragmentation, stuff like that, and below 20 millimeters, you can't get a practical amount of fill in those types of things. And so that really is a lot of what defines small. Medium caliber is typically taken as 2 to sort of 20 to 50 millimeter. And that really is because that medium caliber space is really defined by, what you can jam into an automatic, cannon on a vehicle. So you won't find a lot that's on a vehicle that's larger than 50 millimeters and is anything other than manual action. And that's manual with an auto loader or when it's manually loaded. Ultimately, you're talking about a bridge loading cannon or something like that at that stage where the machine or the person loads the manual action and then resets it. And obviously that leads to large caliber, everything over about 50 millimeters. You talk about large caliber. At that point, manual action, and you cease to be what you really look at as an area effect weapon and start becoming a point effect weapon. So you're really focused on delivering an accurate strike in a single round to a particular target. Now, I think to sort of start this off, when we talk about categorization of vehicles and the principles behind it, understanding IFV versus APC is a pretty good one. APCs typically only have small arms mounted. They don't really have the capacity for self-defense past small arms. They really do rely on the dismounts getting out and fighting for the vehicle. So they're much more of a transport role, although obviously, like we talked about before, they're not anything like a truck because you're paying a lot more weight in armour and you're giving a lot of volume away because volume really costs you a lot to protect. So you give a lot of volume away, you put a lot more armour on the platform and it becomes an APC, not a troop transport truck. On the other hand, an IFV, it typically is fitted with a medium caliber weapon. So you'll see a medium caliber weapon and a turret mounted on an IFV. They'll still carry troops, but you'll see IFVs are typically bigger, heavier, and typically more well protected towards the front. And that really is your point of difference between IFV versus APC. Now that sort of defines that middle ground. So you've got truck, and you've got APC, and you've got IFV. And so what makes the difference between something like an IFV and a tank? Now that we're talking about it in the context that we are, it becomes a little bit easier and more straightforward to see. A tank doesn't carry troops, it doesn't carry logistics supplies, it doesn't carry fuel. All it carries is one large main armament, large caliber, and it's designed for point effect, direct fire against other tanks, or buildings, or IFVs, APCs, anything like that. But the idea is, what you're doing is you're building a platform which is designed to take hits from other tanks and deliver hits to other tanks. The benefit to doing that, and the reason that you do that, is because you want to put the most armament, the most capacity to do damage in the smallest possible space. A lot of military principle is really about focusing down the point of strike to deliver the most effect to the smallest area, and tanks are really a big piece of that. If you look back to that iron triangle concept, you're looking to optimize as much as you can of all three of those. And you tend to size for transport where you can, so a lot of the width of tanks is defined by what you can drive them through. The heights are generally as low as you can while maintaining breech motion to get the gun up and down so you can fire at maximum elevation, minimum depression. And motion for the turret. That's why tanks tend to have engines at the rear versus APCs where you have the engine at the front, so that or APCs and IFVs, so people can exit at the rear in APCs and IFVs, so they're not walking out in direct fire, versus tanks, where if you put the engine at the rear, you can get that turret a few hundred millimeters lower. You're really optimizing to make the gun point at things and to take the smallest number of hits, be as covert as possible when you're toting around an enormous gun. Something that really helps understand this is looking at tank protection. So if you look at this image here, what I've done is I've taken photographs of the T-72, and what you're looking at is an image from the top with the gun facing down and left, and then two images of the inside with the gun facing up and left. So sorry, they're not quite the same alignment, but what you will see is that there's an indication of the main armor thickness on the front of that T-72, and you're looking at something pushing up towards maybe a metre of actual armour. And like we talked about before, there'll be a lot of compromise in that metre of depth to try and get back your weights to stop this thing weighing too much. The other thing you'll notice is that the only place that's heavily armoured comparatively is the front. So you've got probably a metre's thickness of armour on the front of the T-72 there, and you've got probably in the ballpark of 200-300 millimetres of side armour. Now the side armour won't just be a slab of steel either, because they'll be trying to optimise that to get weight out as well. But Ultimately, these things are really optimized to pointing them towards your enemy, which is what you're supposed to be doing. You're pointing the gun towards them, and at the same time, you're pointing the armor towards them, so you've got best protection facing forward. When you look at an IFV and you compare that to a tank, this I think really drives home the comparison. When you look at an IFV, there's about the same amount of space in the turret, even though the turret is physically a lot smaller. And that's because on that T-72, the turret probably weighs 16, 18 tons, including the gun. When you look at the BMP-3 here, the turret's probably about 4 tons, maybe 3, 4 tons. And none of that is in crew accommodations. They'll have given the crew, in both cases, the smallest possible volume they can occupy, because the more volume they give them, the more they've got to protect, the more the thing weighs. So they'll give them the smallest possible volume to occupy in both cases. And what you'll find is that the total volume difference and the total mass difference really is in gun and in armor. When you look at this as well, you'll also see that there's an enormous rear crew space compared to what's in the tank. The tank, like all of that open space at the rear is space that just doesn't exist in the T-72 or the T-90M. And that's because all of that is engine or gun controls or armor. BMP-3 and the T-72, T-90M, they're roughly the same size. The T-90 and T-72 are a little bit shorter than the BMP-3, and the BMP-3 weighs about a third as much. So you're putting on heaps more armor mass, and you're taking heaps less internal volume. So that's where that's actually happening. It's worth thinking back to what we were talking about before and understanding other classes of vehicles so that we can sort of see where they fit as well. Now, self-propelled guns and mortars, when you're talking about artillery and indirect fire weapons, and the difference there is basically direct fire weapons, you point at your target, indirect fire, you point so that a ballistic arc will take the round to the target. And that's important for 2 reasons. One is, if you're pointing an indirect fire weapon directly at your target, you've made mistakes a lot earlier in that process. You shouldn't be on the fighting line with an indirect fire weapon. So if you were there, you're already in trouble, and that's reflected in the protection. So if you look here, we've got a Russian 152mm self-propelled artillery gun, and we've got an airdroppable 120mm mortar, and these vehicles both weigh less than comparatively sized armoured vehicles. So in the top image, you can actually see a T-72 or T-90M, similar platform, in the image, and it's substantially smaller than that gun, but the gun weighs a lot less. And this is basically because you're getting up a lot of internal volume, you've got a lot of weight in the self-propelled gun, but you're giving away a lot of protection. They're only really designed for counter-battery fire, so when people fire back at you when you fire. So they're designed to protect against fragments. And the same thing's true of the 120mm mortar down the bottom. So they'll be capable of repelling small arms and and mortar fragments and not much else. You don't want to put them on the front line. They're really protected against a lot less, even if they've got a gun that looks visually similar sometimes to the other vehicles. They're a substantially different role. Something else that's a bit interesting to look at is something like a tank destroyer. I'm not really aware of militaries using tank destroyers since the Second World War, but it's an interesting topic regardless, because one of the benefits of a tank destroyer is if you know better where the enemy's coming from, you can put in a gun on a hard mount with relatively little traverse, and you get a substantial weight benefit from that. You can put all the same protection on, you can keep the system quite a lot lower. In this case, what we're looking at is a Jagdpanzer 7 versus a Panther in terms of mass comparison. They've got the same gun, roughly similar protection. The Jagdpanzer weighs about probably 60% of what the Panther weighs, and they've got similar protection, similar mobility. In fact, the Jagdpanzer probably has better mobility, but you obviously give away that full 360-degree gun motion, that type of stuff. So that really is what differentiates a tank from a tank destroyer. So if it's got a fixed gun, tank destroyer. If it's got a turret, tank. Separate to that, what you'll see is assault guns. And so assault guns are something a bit different. So an assault gun really depends on detecting enemies first. And a lot of that really surrounds the idea of providing light, mobile infantry support rather than sort of filling that tank-on-tank role. So the idea in a lot of cases with these types of things is you fly them in, or you can transport more of them, or you can transport them with littoral forces coming over shores, stuff like that, where tanks become a lot more of a problem. And where you're doing that, you're trading off protection. That protection trade-off is a pretty significant trade-off. But what really differentiates these is that you're still talking about a large caliber weapon, but in this case, you're talking about something where a tank round will go in one end, come out the other, turn it to dust. No carrying capacity other than crew. Coming down towards that 20-ton mark as opposed to the 60-ton mark of an equivalent tank. And then finally, what we've got is tankettes. Tankettes, things like that, they pop up from time to time. I think they're a really cool concept. They aren't heavily utilised by most militaries other than Germany at the moment, to the best of my knowledge. And they're really around the Weasel or Wiesel group of tankettes. And what they do is they take that tank concept and build it around a medium caliber weapon. So in that case, essentially you're taking all the same logic that you took with the tank and you're shrinking it down, and you go from 60 tons for a Leopard 2 down to 6 tons for a Weasel. And that's a cool concept. And that means that then you can start transporting them with a lot of air mobile assets. They become much more airdroppable, things like that. They also have a lower logistics footprint, but obviously the trade-off there is not just can you not kill a tank, but you can't take a hit from a tank. But on the other hand, they do provide a really good level of firepower support, which normally wouldn't be available. These guys can potentially go toe-to-toe with other military IFVs, stuff like that. So from that point of view, they deliver a really good bang for your buck, but you need to be very specific about the way you're using it. If you've got any questions, I really enjoy, exploring these principles-based exercises. I hope that I've helped people understand that continuum in terms of the logistics, from effectively a non-combat role or combat support role, all of the way up to that frontline pointing end of the spear. Thanks.